We begin on an almost alien Earth, long before the world learned its slow lunar rhythm, an Earth where the oceans did not yet inhale and exhale along the shores. It is a planet still finding its footing in the cosmos, a place shaped by volcanic breath, drifting continents, and sunlight filtering through a young atmosphere, but noticeably lacking one crucial feature: the steady pull of a large nearby moon. Without it, the seas are broad, heavy, and strangely reserved, like great sleeping animals unsure if they're meant to move at all. Their surfaces tremble only when winds pass across them, or when deep geological forces shake the seafloor. Otherwise, the coastlines of this primordial Earth remain still, almost shy, waiting for a reason to become interesting. Before we follow the slow rhythm of tides and coastal life, take a quiet moment to like and subscribe to the Late Night Scientist channel, and let me know in the comments when and where you're listening, so this gentle science can reach more sleepy listeners drifting off with us tonight. Now let's begin. In this quiet age, the boundary between land and sea is not yet a stage for drama. There are no foaming waves carving cliffs, no rhythmic retreats revealing tide pools, no twice-daily transformations turning beaches into temporary worlds. Instead, the ocean's edge is more like a polite line drawn in the sand, one that wind might disturb more often than water does. The shallows bask under sunlight, their chemistry slowly evolving, but without the constant churning that tides would one day provide. Sediments settle gently, forming calm gradients from beach to deep water. Shorelines shift only over centuries or millennia, nudged by tectonics, not by the moon's absent tug. Life exists, but it keeps to familiar places. Most early life dwells in the open ocean or thrives in isolated niches, leaving coasts relatively barren. To these early organisms, the shoreline is simply the edge of the world, not the bustling frontier it will one day become. Without tides, there is no cyclical drying or flooding to challenge them, no alternating conditions that compel innovation. The coastal zone is stable, excessively so, and evolution doesn't find much inspiration in stability. It prefers a little chaos, just enough inconsistency to reward new ideas. Here, nature seems to be lingering with crossed arms, quietly waiting for something, anything, to start tugging on the oceans. The continents themselves wear different faces in this era. Their surfaces are rough and volcanic, their outlines unrecognizable compared to modern maps. Rain falls acidic and warm, and rivers carve their shapes without interference from tidal surges. Beaches are coarse, mineral-rich, and oddly silent. If we could drift along them, we'd hear little more than wind brushing over rock and the distant murmurs of a restless, magma-warmed planet. The ocean's edge has not yet learned to speak in the language of waves. But despite the stillness, this is not a lifeless world. In the seas, early organisms float, divide, and slowly experiment with existence. Cyanobacteria bloom in shallow waters, releasing oxygen into the air in small, persistent breaths. Microbial colonies cling to submerged rocks, silently practicing endurance. They operate on geological timescales, with no sense that anything is missing. Yet the absence of tides leaves the coastal environment simple, almost too simple, for the kind of evolutionary leaps that require environmental fluctuation. The ocean surface is a broad, calm ceiling. The shoreline is a stable floor, and life remains suspended between them, content but unchallenged. Even the light behaves differently here. Without significant tidal mixing, nutrients settle in predictable layers. Sunlit shallows remain nutrient-poor, while deeper waters hoard richness. Vertical mixing is sluggish, limiting how far certain organisms can drift or spread. Evolution, ever patient, continues its slow crawl, but without the push and pull that tides will one day offer. Its pace at the shoreline is contemplative, like a painter sitting before a blank canvas, waiting for a spark of inspiration. Yet beneath this calm surface, Earth is preparing. The planet spins quickly, its day far shorter than today's 24 hours. Its molten interior churns, stirring magnetic fields and releasing plumes of heat through fractures in the crust. Its oceans, though quiet, are immense reservoirs of potential energy. And orbiting not far away, a glowing sphere of molten rock, the early moon begins to cool, stabilize, and settle into its gravitational partnership with Earth. The ingredients for change are assembling, even if the oceans haven't noticed. If you walk this untouched shoreline, you might think the world has reached its final form. But evolution, in its quiet humor, tends to treat final forms as temporary. It allows stillness only as a prelude, and here on this tideless coast, the prelude is long, atmospheric, and deceptively serene. The oceans wait like breath held in the lungs, unaware that soon they will learn a rhythm that will guide life for billions of years. One could imagine nature looking out over these motionless coasts and tapping its foot, wondering when the moon will finally settle into the right place. After all, once the moon begins its gentle pull, the oceans will not merely move, they will transform. The edges of continents will shift from passive boundaries into ecosystems of constant change. Life will learn to hold on, to let go, to rise, to fall, to take advantage of every new moment the tides bring. But for now, in this earliest chapter, the world stands just before that moment. A planet waiting for the first note of a rhythm that will define the coastlines forever. And so we close this opening chapter on a still earth, quiet, calm, and exquisitely uneventful. A world before the pull, a world on the brink of learning to breathe. The change does not begin with noise or spectacle, but with a presence, a new celestial companion taking its place in the sky. As the young Earth cools and stabilizes, the moon settles into a more defined orbit, no longer the molten, chaotic sphere it once was. Its surface hardens, its glow steadies, and with that quiet transformation, a relationship begins. A gravitational dialogue between planet and satellite that will alter the oceans forever. From this point on, Earth is no longer alone, and the seas, once still and contemplative, begin to move in response. Gravity, of course, is not a dramatic communicator. It doesn't shout, it tugs. And it is through this steady, persistent tugging that the moon begins reshaping Earth's waters. At first, the effect is subtle. Slight bulges in the ocean surface, a swell so gradual that only the most observant ancient observer, if such an organism existed, might notice. But over time, the pull becomes a rhythm. The seas shift their weight, leaning gently toward the moon, then relaxing back as Earth rotates. The first tides arrive not as crashing surf, but as a slow lifting and lowering of the waterline, a kind of planetary breathing. The shore, once a static place, begins learning the difference between what it means to be wet and dry on a repeating schedule. This early tidal world is unlike anything that will come after. The moon is still closer to Earth, much closer, so the tidal forces it exerts are far stronger. Coastlines, which spent eons living quiet, predictable lives, suddenly host waters that can rise dramatically before receding again hours later. The range of high to low tide is vast, reshaping landscapes with every cycle. These first tides are not gentle taps on the world's edge. They are sweeping gestures that pull and release enormous volumes of water, leaving behind fresh patterns in sand and sediment. Beaches stretch and contract. Bays fill and empty. Shallow areas become deep for a time, then vanish again to expose long drowned surfaces. The shoreline discovers motion, and the planet starts to feel more alive. In this world, the ocean becomes a restless partner to the land. Newly mobile waters carve into soft rock, sculpting the earliest tidal flats and estuaries. Sediments begin to travel farther than they ever could before, redistributed by the moon's insistent guidance. Channels deepen under the persistent rhythm. Coastal plains become laboratories for physical change, places where landscapes reconfigure themselves not over millennia, but over the span of a single day. The continents do not yet have names, but they do have edges that now redraw themselves like artists revisiting a sketch. The atmosphere, too, experiences the repercussions of this new dynamic. As the tides rise and fall, they stir the interface between water and air, blending heat and moisture. Early weather patterns grow more complex as evaporation increases and currents become more active. Waves begin to form, not the dramatic breakers of modern coastlines, but the first consistent undulations influenced by the moon's pull. Where wind once skimmed silently over smooth waters, it now interacts with surfaces already in motion. The sea gains texture. The air grows patterned. The planet's systems begin to harmonize in ways they never have. And in these newly dynamic coastal zones, chemistry becomes more adventurous. The repeated advance and retreat of seawater creates alternating conditions that were previously impossible. Minerals dissolve and reform in cycles. Salinity fluctuates with predictable rhythm. Organic molecules concentrate, disperse, and mingle in ways that a static coast could never encourage. While life has not yet flocked to the shores, the potential for life to exploit these conditions expands dramatically. Tides provide diversity in the environment, different temperatures, different concentrations of nutrients, different textures of substrate, all shifting with regularity. Variation creates opportunity, and opportunity is evolution's favorite pastime. The moon may not intend to play matchmaker between physics and biology, but it does so anyway. By simply existing in the right place, it provides Earth with a tempo, a reliable pulse that will shape the planet's future ecosystems. In its early days, the moon appears enormous in the sky, filling it like a pale, cratered guardian. Its presence is impossible to ignore, though the oceans seem less impressed and more compelled. They follow its pull with the stubborn consistency of someone who wasn't planning to move, but gets gently nudged until standing becomes the only option. As days pass, and Earth's rotation slows ever so slightly, the tidal rhythm stabilizes. What began as wild, sweeping tides gradually settles into a pattern, though still far stronger than modern ones. This predictability becomes one of Earth's defining features. Water rising and falling, withdrawing and returning, day after day, without fail. For the first time, the coast becomes a zone of constant renewal. Nothing stays the same for long, and that change itself becomes a resource. If Chapter 1 was a portrait of stillness, Chapter 2 is a portrait of awakening. The moon's influence teaches the oceans to move, and in doing so teaches the planet to breathe in cycles. The shoreline's identity shifts from a static line to a dynamic, living system, one that will eventually become home to some of the most resilient and inventive forms of life on Earth. And if nature had been standing on that ancient shoreline, watching the waterline inch higher, then quietly lower again, it might have smiled with a kind of cosmic satisfaction. At long last, something had started tugging on the oceans, and the world would never be still again. With tides now part of Earth's daily rhythm, the coastline becomes a place of shifting boundaries, no longer a single, unbroken line, but a zone that expands and contracts like a living thing. As the ocean advances and retreats, it leaves behind a scatter of shallow basins, puddles, pools, and channels. Some form in depressions in the sand. Others gather in rocky pockets or temporary lagoons. These are the earliest tidal margins created not by storms or tectonics, but by the quiet insistence of the moon's pull. And in this restless architecture of water, something remarkable begins to happen. Chemistry learns patience. At high tide, these pools brim with seawater, their surfaces shimmering under the sun. They appear simple, just temporary extensions of the ocean. But their fate is not to remain full for long. When the water retreats, the pools shrink, thin films left behind on drying sediments. Sunlight warms them, wind skims across them, and evaporation begins its work. Water leaves, minerals stay, molecules concentrate. The pools become tiny chemical cauldrons, not boiling, but reducing, distilling themselves into denser and denser mixtures. It's in these evaporating moments that the first glimmers of complexity take shape. Simple organic molecules, already present in the ocean or delivered by meteorites and hydrothermal vents, find themselves squeezed into close quarters. When they bump into each other in the open ocean, they often drift apart, too diluted to do anything ambitious. But here, in the cramped patience of a drying pool, they linger. They encounter one another repeatedly, forming fleeting associations, little molecular greetings that might, by sheer stubborn chance, linger long enough to turn into something more interesting. Then the tide returns, sweeping its cool waters back over the land. It dilutes the concentrated pools, breaks apart some of the fragile associations that formed during evaporation, and introduces new ingredients from the sea. The chemistry resets, but not entirely. Some molecules cling to sediments or lodge within crevices. Others bind to minerals formed during the drying period. Over time, these cycles of flooding and withdrawal create environments that behave less like puddles and more like natural laboratories running daily experiments. Each cycle writes a kind of chemical note in the margins of the shoreline, erased and rewritten, but never completely forgotten. These early tidal margins exist long before recognizable life forms appear here. They are playgrounds for prebiotic chemistry, settings where molecules discover that the world can change in predictable ways. And predictability, even in its simplest form, is a powerful teacher. As the cycles repeat, the pools become increasingly diverse in their composition. Some gather more salts than others. Some grow warmer under longer sun exposure. Some remain shaded in rocky niches, allowing slower, cooler reactions. No two pools are alike, and yet all share the same daily rhythm: flood, concentrate, dilute, repeat. Within this repeating pattern, organic compounds begin forming chains, small at first, then longer, occasionally folding or curling in ways that make them more stable. Mineral surfaces act as supports, catalysts, or simply sticky places where molecules gather like gossiping neighbors. Sometimes chemical reactions proceed faster when the pools are nearly dry. Other times, the returning water sets off reactions that weren't possible the day before. These pools become classrooms where chemistry learns to respond to change, and where certain molecules, by chance, prove more stable, more persistent, or simply more willing to stick around through the cycle. Nothing in these pools thinks. Nothing is alive. But the ingredients for life begin to sort themselves out, like characters slowly taking their positions on a stage before the curtain rises. Some molecules form protective layers around themselves, not intentionally, of course, but because their structure happens to favor it. Others bond to mineral grains that anchor them through the tide's push and pull, allowing them to survive cycles that would wash simpler compounds away. Over thousands and millions of years, these marginal environments become crucibles of chemical resilience. Time behaves differently here. A single cycle lasts perhaps a day, but millions of cycles unfold with quiet persistence. The shoreline shifts with geological processes, but wherever the tides can leave behind shallow pools, the chemistry continues. The moon's influence ensures that no pool remains stable for long. Yet the instability is precisely what gives these margins their creative power. Stability supports preservation. Instability supports invention. And invention, especially in chemistry, is the first shadow of evolution. One might imagine molecules learning to be patient, not literally, but metaphorically, waiting through the drying to gather strength, then welcoming the flood as a chance to disperse, regroup, and reform in new configurations. If the open ocean is a gentle, endless drift, the tidal margins are the opposite, intermittent, demanding, and full of possibility. They become the selective pressure before biology, shaping which molecules persist simply by placing them in a world that keeps changing on schedule. Occasionally, a pool dries out completely, leaving behind a brittle crust of salts and organic residues. When the next tide arrives, it cracks open the crust, dissolving fragments and carrying them into neighboring pools. Chemistry migrates, recombines, and tries again. If chemistry had feelings, it might regard the tides with a mix of annoyance and admiration, an unpredictable roommate who rearranges everything twice a day but also keeps life interesting. As the chapter closes, the tidal margins stand as quiet pioneers. They do not yet host organisms, but they host the rhythms that life will later depend on. Cycles of scarcity and abundance, exposure and immersion, concentration and dispersal. In these early coastal pools, chemistry discovers that time itself has a pulse, and that sometimes, to become something new, one must learn to wait through the drying and trust that the water will return. By the time microbial life begins creeping toward the shifting boundaries of the shoreline, Earth has already established its tidal heartbeat. The pools of earlier ages have nurtured chemical ingenuity, and now the coast becomes a gathering place for organisms capable of taking advantage of its predictable instability. These early coastal pioneers are not plants, not animals, not even algae as we know them today. They are microbial communities, dense, layered mats of tiny cooperative cells clinging to sediments in sheets as thin as linen or as thick as carpets. They live in a world defined by exposure and immersion, where the sun can be a harsh overseer and the returning tide a relief that arrives on schedule, but not always gently. These microbial mats do not drift or swim. Instead, they settle on the mud like determined residents who have chosen the neighborhood precisely because it is inconvenient. They spread horizontally, coating tidal flats in films of living texture. If you were to step quietly into one of these early tidal margins, the ground beneath your feet might feel slick or springy, not quite solid earth, not quite water, but something in between. These mats form colonies with layers of specialization, surface-dwelling microbes capturing sunlight, deeper layers performing chemical transformations, and bottom layers binding the whole structure to the sediment. To survive in an environment where the ocean repeatedly leaves them behind, these cells cultivate a remarkable talent: the art of holding on. Some species produce sticky secretions that glue them to each other and to the sand grains beneath them. This glue, primitive but effective, keeps the community intact during the dry hours when the tide recedes. Other microbes, faced with the same challenge, adopt a different strategy. They curl up, slow down, and simply wait. When the water leaves, they endure desiccation without protest, entering a temporary state of metabolic quietude. When the tide returns, they rehydrate, uncurl, and resume their work as though nothing inconvenient had happened. Life in these mats is rhythmic, But the mat itself is not passive. Over time, its structure thickens as new layers grow atop old ones. Tidal cycles press down on the mat repeatedly, compacting it, but the living surface remains soft and responsive. Sunlight provides energy, though harsh midday exposure can be perilous. In the dry periods, the mat's upper layers can form protective films, thin, shimmery coatings that reduce water loss and shield the underlying cells from ultraviolet radiation. These protections are not elaborate. Evolution has not yet had time to produce the intricate support systems of later organisms, but they are effective. In the simplicity of these adaptations lies a powerful message. Survival sometimes means doing just enough, not everything. During high tide, the mats become bustling hubs of microscopic life. Water flows across their surfaces, delivering nutrients and carrying away waste. Tiny filaments sway gently with the movement, giving the mat a faint, almost grassy appearance under the shallow water. Some microbes position themselves vertically, like miniature solar collectors, maximizing their access to light. Others move slowly along slippery surfaces, rearranging themselves into more favorable positions. Cooperation is their currency. Individuals rarely survive alone, but within the mat, they create a community capable of weathering the tide's dual demands. Over millions of tidal cycles, these mats gradually influence the very land they cling to. Their sticky secretions trap sediments, stabilizing them and preventing erosion. Mudflats become firmer, more cohesive. As the mats grow thicker, they create small ridges and undulations that alter water flow during the tide's return. In modest but persistent ways, microbial life begins shaping the coastline, not by building towering structures, but by holding the ground together, quite literally, one grain of sand at a time. The mats also alter the chemical environment of their surroundings. Their metabolic processes release oxygen, slowly enriching the shallow waters and the thin films of air that hover just above the exposed surfaces during low tide. The boundary between wet and dry becomes chemically dynamic. Pockets of trapped moisture within the mat host a different set of reactions than the fully exposed upper layers. Over time, the organisms in these layers diversify, each adapting to slightly different conditions created by the mat's structure and the tide's rhythms. It is here, in this dynamic interplay, that evolution's quiet humor becomes apparent. When faced with the challenge of repeatedly being left high and dry, some microbes respond with elaborate biochemistry, while others simply produce more glue. Being stuck to the ground, it turns out, is occasionally a valid strategy, especially when the alternative is washing away with the tide like an indecisive tourist. The simplicity of this approach belies its effectiveness. Microbes that cling survive. Those that don't drift into deeper waters and lose their advantage. In time, microbial mats become some of the most prominent life forms along ancient shorelines. They stretch across wide expanses of coastal terrain, creating living tapestries that expand and contract with the tides. These mats are not simply communities, they are ecosystems in miniature, each layer performing tasks that support the whole. Their persistence transforms the shoreline into a place where life does more than exist. it organizes. And so the art of holding on becomes one of evolution's earliest coastal lessons. Long before plants root themselves in soil or animals learn to scuttle across beaches, these microbial mats establish the principle that timing, endurance, and a willingness to stay put can turn an unpredictable environment into a niche worth claiming. In their quiet, sticky determination, they teach the shoreline how to welcome life, and they teach life how to brave the tides. As microbial mats become confident residents of the shoreline, some communities begin experimenting with a new form of construction, one that extends their influence upward rather than outward. Instead of merely coating the tidal flats like living wallpaper, they start to build. The result of this ancient architectural impulse is the stromatolite, a layered, stone-like tower formed by generations of microbes trapping sediments, cementing minerals, and steadily lifting themselves toward the light. These structures rise slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet over time they become some of the earliest landmarks along Earth's coasts, silent monuments to persistence, cooperation, and the microbial desire to gain just a little extra height in a very wet world. Stromatolites begin as thin films of cyanobacteria spreading over submerged surfaces. As sunlight pours through the shallow water, these microbes use it to power their metabolism, producing oxygen as a byproduct and creating a local environment rich in dissolved minerals. When fine sediments drift over them during a tidal cycle, the sticky surface of the microbial mat traps the particles. Instead of letting the sediments smother them, the microbes simply grow upward to stay above the deposited layer. In this way, each generation of microbes leaves behind a thin sheet of mineral-rich material, then builds a new living surface on top. Layer after layer, their insistence creates columns that slowly break free from the flatness of the seafloor. The pace of this construction is slow enough to make glaciers look impatient. But stromatolites do not measure time in days or years. They measure it in tidal cycles, thousands upon thousands of them stacked like pages in a book, written entirely in stone and sunlight. From above, a mature stromatolite field looks like a patchwork of rounded domes, each one a living skyscraper built by organisms without nerves, muscles, or any sense that skyscrapers are impressive. The significance of these structures is profound. For the first time, life is not merely adapting to the physical world, it is sculpting it. Stromatolites alter water flow around them, slowing currents and creating pockets of calmer water in their lee. Sediments accumulate differently because of their presence, changing the texture of nearby seafloors. Even wave patterns shift slightly as they encounter clusters of these sturdy microbial towers. In modest but measurable ways, life begins to push back against the tides, shaping the very forces that once dictated its fate. Within and around these stone-like domes, new microhabitats emerge. Tiny crevices between layers remain moist, even during low tide, offering refuge to organisms sensitive to drying. Pools form in sheltered areas between stromatolites, capturing nutrient-rich water that lingers long after the tide withdraws. Certain microbes thrive on the shaded sides of the structures, while others bask on sunlit surfaces. The diversity of conditions, light, moisture, flow rate, creates a patchwork of niches that supports a broader range of early life. Stromatolite fields become bustling microbial cities, each dome hosting its own community of chemical specialists. Nature, it seems, has a fondness for structures that invite variety. And evolution, seeing an opportunity, continues to experiment with these layered forms. Some stromatolites grow broad and low, like flattened cakes. Others rise steeply, forming conical shapes that catch more sunlight or lift themselves above competing colonies. Some communities create tightly laminated layers, producing smooth, rounded domes. Others produce irregular, crinkled formations that trap even more sediments. The diversity of these forms is a reminder that even microbes, when given enough time and enough sediment, can become surprisingly creative architects. Yet the most transformative effect of stromatolites is not their shape, but their metabolism. Cyanobacteria produce oxygen, and stromatolite fields, by virtue of their immense surface area, release enormous quantities of it into the water and air. Over millions of years, these structures contribute significantly to transforming Earth's atmosphere, paving the way for more complex life. They do not know they are changing the planet. They simply grow. But in their patient growth, they rewrite the chemical script of Earth's oceans and skies. The presence of oxygen also influences mineral precipitation around stromatolites. Iron, once freely dissolved in ancient seawater, begins reacting with oxygen, forming rust-colored sediments that fall out of solution. These shifts in chemistry subtly alter how stromatolites build, what minerals they incorporate, and how firmly they cement themselves. The coastline gradually acquires a new palette of colors and textures, shaped not by tectonics, but by biological activity. Stromatolites are resilient, but not invincible. Waves strike them twice daily, abrading their surfaces. Sediment-laden currents scour at their bases. Storm surges topple the occasional tower. Yet the microbial mats grow back, rebuild, and push upward once more. These organisms understand, in their quiet biochemical way, that surviving along a tidal coastline requires endurance more than elegance. If some later creature were to ask them how they handle constant tidal stress, a stromatolite might simply reply, if stromatolites had any patience for conversation, that persistence is easier when you move at a pace too slow for trouble to notice. In time, stromatolite gardens stretch along coastlines, turning once flat tidal flats into textured landscapes. Their influence ripples outward, reshaping currents, sediment patterns, and the availability of sheltered microhabitats. They are the first engineers of Earth's coasts, constructing beauty not through intention, but through repetition. Their towers, layered like ancient manuscripts, become part of the geological record, a testament to life's early power to alter its environment. And so, in these patient stone towers built from sunlight, sediment, and microbial determination, life takes its first architectural steps. The tides may rise and fall, but stromatolites stand their ground, teaching the shoreline a lesson that will echo through future ages. Sometimes, modifying the world is simply a matter of showing up, layer by layer, and refusing to be washed away. As stromatolite fields quietly reshape coastlines and release oxygen into the shallow seas, the atmosphere above them begins to change in ways no organism has prepared for. Oxygen, once a trace gas barely worth mentioning, starts to accumulate. At first, the increase is gentle, an invisible shift in the air and water. But over millions of years, this change becomes profound. Oxygen dissolves into tidal pools, infuses the thin film of water that coat exposed sediments, and circulates through currents that sweep across coastal platforms. A breathless world is slowly learning what it means to inhale. But oxygen, for all its usefulness to future creatures, is initially a double-edged experiment. To early life, rich oxygen is not a gift. It is a chemical hazard. Many ancient microbes evolved in conditions where oxygen was scarce, even unwelcome. And when confronted with higher concentrations, they experience it the way a candle might experience an unexpected gust of wind, destabilizing. Oxygen can react unpredictably, breaking apart delicate molecules that older cells rely on. In the tidal zones where water levels now fluctuate constantly, these reactions become more dramatic. When the tide rolls in, coastal mats and microbial communities find themselves flooded with oxygenated seawater. The air above mixes with the water below, saturating these shallow habitats in an atmosphere far more reactive than the world they evolved in. Metabolism speeds up, sometimes to advantageous levels, sometimes to frantic ones. Organisms capable of harnessing oxygen discover new sources of energy, while others scramble to protect themselves from oxidative damage. It is a time of biochemical innovation, but also of biochemical panic. As the tide retreats, the story flips. Pools shrink, water becomes stagnant. The oxygen that once flooded these habitats is quickly consumed. What remains is an environment starved of the very gas that drowned it hours before. Where high tide brought abundance, low tide brings scarcity. Organisms that adapted to use oxygen must now endure its sudden absence. Those that still prefer low oxygen conditions must cope with periodic floods of the very substance they spent millions of years avoiding. And so the tidal zone becomes a theater of extremes. Oxygen-rich inundation, followed by suffocating stillness. Each cycle forces organisms to solve the problem anew. Some microbes develop protective enzymes that neutralize oxygen's more aggressive tendencies. Others retreat deeper into sediments during high tide, seeking pockets where oxygen cannot reach. A few bold lineages begin to flirt with the new gas, developing metabolisms that use it efficiently during its brief appearances, treating oxygen like a guest who brings energy-rich snacks but visits unpredictably. Communities split into specialists. On the surface, organisms learn to tolerate oxygenated waters when the tide is high. Just below them, other microbes inhabit layers where oxygen rarely penetrates, emerging only when the surface dries enough to give them space. This stratification turns sediment layers into miniature biochemical apartment complexes. Aerobic tenants on the top floor, anaerobic tenants in the basement, and a suite of transitional organisms living in the middle floors, prepared to shift their metabolism depending on the conditions delivered by the moon. Even the physical look of the coastline begins to change. Iron, now reacting readily with the rising oxygen, forms rust-colored layers that stain sediments in warm hues. Minerals once stable under low oxygen conditions now rearrange themselves, creating chemical gradients that run through tidal flats. Pools that once hosted only gentle chemical variation now develop distinct zones with sharp transitions, highly oxygenated at the surface, nearly oxygen-free just a few millimeters below. The shoreline becomes a layered world, partly oxidized, partly ancient, partly something entirely new. For the first time, organisms begin to anticipate the tides. They cannot think, of course, but evolution equips them with responses tuned to rhythm. Some microbes produce pigments that protect them from oxidative bursts during high tide. Others build thicker cell walls to slow oxygen's entry. A few begin producing protective bubbles, tiny envelopes of gas or slime that shield them until conditions swing back to their preferred state. The tidal zone becomes a place where survival is dictated not by speed or strength, but by timing and flexibility. Organisms that endure through both oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor intervals gain an advantage, learning to breathe when possible and wait when not, even if the word breathe is still millions of years away from its familiar meaning. The environment itself amplifies the drama. Tidal channels carry oxygen-rich water inland, leaving behind pockets of chemical variety. Larger pools, protected from wind, lose oxygen more quickly than smaller, exposed ones. A shallow depression that remains waterlogged between tides becomes a sanctuary for organisms fleeing high oxygen conditions. A neighboring pool, exposed to wind and midday light, becomes a hot spot for early aerobic innovators testing their oxidative endurance. The result is a mosaic coast, each pool a different challenge, each challenge shaping life in new directions. As oxygen levels continue to rise in the atmosphere and the seas, the tidal zone becomes a proving ground for metabolic diversity. Those who can tolerate the new gas flourish in upper layers and sunlit pools. Those who cannot retreat to deeper sediments or to niches where water remains stagnant and oxygen poor. The new landscape favors adaptability, resilience, and inventive chemistry. Evolution, observing all this through its slow but eager lens, seems to offer a wry commentary. If life wanted an easy time, it certainly picked the wrong address. But organisms that survive this chemically fickle world gain tools that will serve them for eons. They learn to use oxygen, avoid oxygen, modulate oxygen, or hide from it. Skills that become foundational as more complex life begins to emerge. In this chapter of Earth's history, the tides themselves do not change, but everything else does. The shoreline becomes a place where opportunity and danger ebb and flow together, and where life discovers that mastering breath, whether literal or metaphorical, will be one of its greatest evolutionary talents. By the time the Cambrian period unfolds, the shoreline is no longer a quiet stage for microbial dramas. It has become a frontier of shifting conditions, unpredictable exposures, and chemical gradients that change by the hour. And now, for the first time in Earth's long history, something with legs, or at least leg-like contraptions, is heading toward it. Animals, newly equipped with mobility, armor, and a faint sense of curiosity, begin approaching the tidal zones. They are not driven by bold ambition so much as by opportunity. Fewer predators, abundant resources, and a landscape rearranged twice daily by the moon. It is the Cambrian, after all, and everything is trying something new. The shoreline is simply the latest experiment. These early animals are nothing like the creatures that will one day scamper across beaches. They crawl, they paddle, they shuffle. Some roll awkwardly in the shallows, as if still negotiating which end of their body is in charge. Many possess hard exoskeletons, an evolutionary innovation that initially developed for protection from predators, but now proves surprisingly useful in tidal environments. When the water retreats and leaves them briefly exposed, their shells prevent drying and shield them from the sun. When they scrape across abrasive sediments, the armor holds up far better than naked skin ever could. Jointed limbs, another Cambrian novelty, become a significant advantage near the shore. In the fully submerged world of earlier eras, fluid buoyancy made elaborate skeletal support unnecessary. But here, in water that sometimes barely covers the creatures, those extra hinges and segments allow them to push, grip, and lift themselves over uneven terrain. The tidal flats introduce a new type of complexity: mud that shifts under pressure, ripples formed by waves, and surfaces that are neither fully solid nor fully liquid. Animals with the ability to adjust their posture, however clumsily, gain access to new microhabitats. Some of these early explorers come seeking food. Microbial mats still coat broad expanses of coastal sediment, and to a Cambrian grazer, they are effectively edible carpets. These mats are thick, nutritious, and slow to move out of the way, an ideal buffet for creatures whose predatory strategies are still in their infancy. Other animals arrive by accident, carried toward shore by currents or seeking refuge from larger predators lurking in deeper waters. Upon discovering that the tidal zone is both safer and stranger than expected, some decide to stay, or at least return often enough for natural selection to start taking notes. But the shoreline is no gentle retreat. The water level drops without warning, leaving creatures stranded in puddles or on damp sediment. Sunlight reflects off wet surfaces, heating them rapidly. Oxygen levels fluctuate dramatically. A pool that was cozy moments ago can turn into a trap as the water drains away. Early animals develop a remarkable tolerance for near misses. Some flatten their bodies to retain moisture. Others burrow instinctively when the water begins to recede, hiding beneath a thin layer of sediment until the tide returns. A few simply endure in place, holding on to the last droplets of water clinging to their limbs or shells. The presence of predators, though reduced, never fully disappears. Some Cambrian hunters follow their prey into shallower waters, only to find themselves confronted with the same challenges: erratic water levels, sunlight they never asked for, and the embarrassing possibility of being left behind by the tide. This dynamic produces a curious evolutionary effect. The predators who can tolerate these conditions, whether through armor, stamina, or sheer stubbornness, begin expanding their hunting grounds. Meanwhile, the prey that can avoid being caught during these unpredictable hours gain a survival advantage. The shoreline becomes a place where survival favors those who adapt quickly, hide well, or refuse to panic. Over generations, coastal populations diversify. Some animals develop slightly thicker shells to slow water loss. Others refine their ability to burrow, sculpting small, water-trapping depressions that act as personal tide pools. A few begin to coordinate their movements with the tides, not consciously, but through rhythms encoded in their biology. They feed during high tide when water softens the mats, and retreat during low tide when exposure threatens them. These patterns, repeated across countless generations, weave the first threads of behavior linked to tidal timing. The physical challenges of the shoreline also produce anatomical experiments. Segmented bodies become more flexible. Limbs strengthen, enabling creatures to lift themselves above drying sediment or cling to surfaces swept by receding water. Sensory structures evolve to detect changes in water pressure, salinity, or the faint warning signs of a dropping tide. Even the shape of the body begins to shift in response to the constant push and pull. Some creatures grow flatter to distribute their weight more evenly on unstable ground, while others become more streamlined, able to slip back into deeper water when necessary. In this shifting zone, survival grows more sophisticated than simple endurance. Animals begin to explore small pools that form between rocks or in depressions. These tide pools, though temporary, act as training arenas. Inside them, creatures experience brief isolation from the larger ocean, still submerged, but in a confined space where predators, oxygen levels, and temperatures differ drastically from the open sea. Those who adapt to these microenvironments gain a distinct advantage, a resilience to change itself. Evolution, ever pleased with small successes, nurtures lineages that thrive in exactly these unpredictable scenarios. If one could watch these early pioneers from above, the sight would be both earnest and slightly comedic. Tiny armored bodies scuttling, paddling, or simply flopping their way through a world that refuses to stay still. Some undoubtedly survive by accident rather than design, perhaps stumbling into the right crevice moments before the water retreats. Others survive because their bodies, by sheer good fortune, happen to be shaped in ways that suit the demands of this experimental terrain. It is here, along this restless threshold, that a new lesson in evolution emerges. The ocean is not polite. It does not wait for stragglers or apologize for abrupt changes. But for those who learn to navigate its whims, the tidal zone becomes a world of opportunity. Movement, once a novelty, becomes a gateway to resilience. Limbs, shells, and curiosity carry the Cambrian creatures into a realm where toughness matters more than grace. And so the shoreline becomes the edge of possibility, a dynamic arena where early animals first test the idea of living between worlds, guided not by certainty but by the rhythm of tides and the stubborn desire to see what happens next. By the time coastal life has fully embraced the challenges of the intertidal zone, the shoreline has transformed into an arena where adaptability is not just useful, it is essential. Here, every tide offers both a promise and a threat. High tide brings mobility, food, and the protective cover of water. Low tide strips all of that away, leaving creatures exposed on a hot, drying landscape where survival depends on preparation made hours earlier. It is a world that rewards anticipation more than speed. And over millions of years, evolution equips its inhabitants with innovations that reflect a simple truth. The shoreline favors those who plan ahead. Armor becomes one of the earliest and most reliable solutions. Many coastal creatures begin developing shells, plates, or hardened exoskeletons, not merely as protection from predators, though predators are always enthusiastic participants in evolution, but also as a shield against harsh environmental conditions. When the tide retreats and exposes the mudflats to the sun, the animals that conceal themselves within sturdy shells retain precious moisture. Shells turn their bodies into portable, self-contained habitats, tiny capsules of safety amid the unpredictable cycles of wet and dry. These shells vary tremendously in form. Some early coastal animals adopt low, rounded shapes that hug the sediment, reducing the surface area exposed to the air. Others develop hinged shells, able to clamp shut in a way that suggests a certain stubborn refusal to acknowledge low tide at all. Spines, ridges, and thickened edges appear, not for show, but to deter hungry neighbors or discourage would-be predators rooting around during the hours when water is absent and risk is highest. In the tidal zone, standing out usually means being eaten, so evolving armored subtlety becomes a trend. But armor alone is not enough. As coastal ecosystems grow more complex, burrowing emerges as a complementary strategy. Animals learn to dig, not deeply at first, just enough to slip beneath the skin of the sediment when the tide begins to fall. These shallow burrows provide several advantages: darkness, cooler temperatures, and a thin but reliable film of retained moisture. Over time, burrowing grows more elaborate. Some creatures dig corkscrew-shaped tunnels that trap water at the bottom. Others create chambers reinforced with mucus or packed sediment, tiny rooms designed for safety and stability. In these buried sanctuaries, they can wait out hours of exposure while predators roam overhead and the sun dries the surface. The act of burrowing itself becomes a specialized art. Bodies streamlined to push through mud efficiently. Limbs adapt, flattening, widening, or gaining hooked tips ideal for scooping sediment. Even mouthparts in certain lineages evolve to serve double duty, scraping at the earth during the day and feeding at night. Many burrowers become sensitive not just to tidal cues, but to subtle shifts in pressure, vibration, and temperature, signals of an approaching tide or an unwelcome visitor. A good burrow is useful, but the ability to know when to retreat into it or when to cautiously emerge is just as crucial. With armor and burrowing now widespread, tidal strategies diversify. Some animals become high-tide specialists, emerging only during the brief hours when water covers their habitat. They feed quickly, move with purpose, and disappear beneath the sediment the moment the tide turns. Other species behave in the opposite way. They take advantage of low tide, when shallow pools trap prey, or when predators are less likely to venture inland. These opportunists develop traits that allow them to endure exposure just long enough to exploit the moment. Thickened skin, moisture-retaining coverings, and behavioral cues that drive them toward shaded crevices all become valuable. The shoreline itself becomes a record of these strategies. Tiny holes pepper the mud, each marking the entrance to a home just below. Trails etched across the sediment show where creatures have ventured out during the final minutes of high tide, returning hastily as the water receded. At low tide, the exposed flats are not empty. They are merely quiet on the surface, concealing a bustling world that stirs just inches below. As the sun moves across the sky, the sediment breathes warmth downward and releases trapped gases upward, while beneath it all, the hidden animals wait in humid patience. Predation also evolves in response to these new defenses. Some hunters learn to pry open shells, developing specialized claws, jaws, or strategies for cracking armored prey. Others refine their sense of smell or touch to locate buried animals beneath the sediment. A few species take advantage of the temporary concentration of life during low tide, stalking the boundary between wet and dry, where stragglers gather in small, vulnerable pools. This ongoing arms race ensures that armor thickens, burrowing deepens, and timing becomes even more precise. Perhaps the most remarkable development in this chapter of coastal evolution is the rise of behavioral planning. These animals do not think in any conscious sense, but natural selection hones instincts that are strikingly forward-looking. Creatures begin reacting not only to the immediate presence of water, but to cues that anticipate its coming and going. Subtle shifts in light, the cooling of evening air, vibrations from encroaching waves, even the smell of freshly stirred sediment, all become signals that guide behavior. Over countless generations, this instinctive timing becomes deeply reliable, as if each species has internalized a miniature version of the tide schedule. Life along these ancient coasts is tough, but it is not chaotic. It is rhythmic. Creatures do not merely endure the tides, they synchronize with them. Where earlier eras demanded brute persistence, this one demands strategy, armor to resist, burrows to hide, behaviors tuned to the moon's pull. Every creature becomes a quiet expert in the art of timing, embracing a lifestyle where survival depends not on overpowering the environment, but on working with its cycles. If evolution could offer advice to its coastal creatures in this age, it might simply say, "The tide won't wait for you, so you'd better be ready before it changes its mind." And through armor, burrowing, and finely tuned instincts, they are ready, turning the intertidal zone into a thriving mosaic of life that knows exactly when to rise and when to retreat. For ages, the coastline has been the domain of microbes, shells, and quietly determined animals digging their way through the sediment. But eventually, something audacious happens. Plants, soft-bodied newcomers on the evolutionary stage, begin inching toward the sea. Their ancestors thrived inland, in freshwater wetlands and along riverbanks where conditions were reliable and salt was a distant rumor. Yet as life continues exploring every edge of opportunity, some plants approach the coastline with the tentative curiosity of travelers wondering whether the view is worth the journey. The shoreline offers an undeniable allure. Tides deliver nutrients with dependable regularity, washing organic debris and mineral-rich sediments onto the land. Sunlight is plentiful. Space is open. But this generosity comes with a price: salt. For early plants, salt is more than a discomfort. It is a destabilizer, a chemical intruder capable of pulling water from their tissues and disrupting the delicate internal balance they rely on. And the tides themselves, rising, falling, pulling, threaten to uproot anything too frail or too easily persuaded by moving water. Approaching the sea is not simply a matter of reaching the coast. It is a negotiation with forces that do not pause for the convenience of vegetation. At first, most plants stay well inland, watching from afar as the waves carve the shoreline with indifference. But some species begin drifting closer through gradual generations, carried not by bravery, but by opportunity. Seeds fall slightly nearer to the coast. Those that survive in soils touched lightly by salt spray gain an edge over their more sensitive relatives. Slowly, plants develop traits that allow them to tolerate the outskirts of the tidal world. Roots that handle minor salinity, stems that remain firm in shifting soils, and leaves with structural tweaks that reduce water loss in breezy, drying conditions. These early coastal plants are not yet entering tidal zones themselves, but they are nuzzling up against them, inhabiting transitional spaces where the ocean's influence is felt but not overwhelming. Here they encounter unique challenges: winds stronger than anything inland, soils that alternate between saturated and parched, and the occasional storm surge that reminds them the sea is unpredictable. For plants accustomed to quiet swamp margins, this new environment demands flexibility, not in the philosophical sense, but literally. Stems that can bend without breaking, leaves that can withstand salt spray without shriveling, and roots that can grip loose sediment will become prized adaptations. Many plants retreat. Their descendants spread inland, content with calmer environments. But others begin to solve the challenges one by one. The first step is tolerance, the ability to live in soils with modest salinity. Specialized cells in their roots start regulating salt intake more carefully, excluding harmful ions while allowing water to pass through. Some plants evolve tiny salt gland structures capable of excreting excess salt, turning their leaves into miniature purification units. In certain species, water storage tissues develop, small internal reservoirs that buffer against unexpected dryness caused by coastal winds. Root systems undergo transformative changes as well. The coastline demands anchorage. Tides tug at the land itself, shifting sediments with each cycle. Plants that fail to grip tightly risk being uprooted in sudden floods or even gradual erosion. As a result, roots grow thicker, more fibrous, and more widely spread. Some plants develop shallow, web-like root networks that hold fast to loose sand. Others plunge their roots deeper, seeking the more stable layers beneath. The result is a surprising architectural feat. Root systems that behave less like simple anchors and more like nets, binding soils in place and stabilizing areas where sediments once drifted freely. While roots learn to resist movement, leaves learn restraint. Coastal winds can be relentless, stripping moisture from surfaces in minutes. Broad, delicate leaves, so effective inland, become liabilities here. Evolution trims them, reshapes them, and coats them. Leaves narrow into tighter shapes that present less surface area to the wind. Waxy coatings develop, reducing water loss and protecting tissues from salt spray. Some species even grow hairy leaf surfaces, tiny insulating layers that trap moisture and soften the impact of harsh gusts. If early coastal animals needed armor to survive, plants answer the same demand through subtle, restrained forms, soft armor instead of hard. With these adjustments, the coastal fringe begins to green. Plants take hold on dunes, in brackish marsh edges, and on raised banks just beyond the reach of the highest tides. Their presence transforms the landscape. Root systems stabilize sediments, slowing erosion. Stems and leaves trap wind-blown sand, gradually building small mounds and ridges. Organic litter accumulates in their shadow, enriching soils that were once mineral poor. In their quiet, plant-like manner, they begin reshaping the border between land and sea. Some of these early pioneers venture closer still, entering zones where tides occasionally flood their roots. These bold species evolve further specializations. Their stems tolerate periodic submersion. Their roots develop channels that transport oxygen to buried tissues, preventing suffocation in waterlogged soils. The distinction between land plant and wetland plant begins to blur, giving rise to forms that thrive in saturated, shifting environments that would drown many of their relatives. Salt tolerance, once a rare gift, becomes a defining trait of shoreline vegetation. Plants that excel at managing internal water balance and controlling salt accumulation spread more successfully along coasts. Their descendants diversify, occupying new microhabitats carved by tides and storms. Over time, different species settle into different roles: stabilizers of dunes, consolidators of mudflats, colonizers of salt-kissed meadows just above the tidal reach. Through all of this, the sea remains an unapologetically demanding neighbor. Storms still send waves crashing farther inland than expected. Salt spray still coats everything with a fine, briny dust. Yet the plants that stay learn to handle these disturbances not through rigidity, but through flexibility, both literally and evolutionarily. Their resilience becomes a quiet triumph, a slow but steady claim on territory once untouched by roots. If evolution could offer gentle commentary on this phase of botanical ambition, it might simply note that while approaching the sea is rarely comfortable, it becomes manageable once you develop the right mix of tolerance, tact, and willingness to bend without breaking. And so plants find their foothold along the ancient coast, not by conquering the tides, but by growing just hardy enough to live beside them, carefully, patiently, and with leaves that know the value of restraint. As plants secure a careful foothold near the shifting edge of the sea, animals continue refining their strategies for life in the intertidal zone. What was once a quiet frontier for microbial mats and hesitant early crawlers now evolves into a contested arena, a place where opportunity and danger arrive on the same waves. Crabs, mollusks, and early fish venture into the narrow strip between land and sea, each discovering that the intertidal zone offers bounty for those who time their movements precisely and punishment for those who misjudge the rhythm. Strength still matters, but strategy begins to matter more. Here, survival often hinges on being in the right place at the right hour, or simply refusing to be available at the wrong one. The intertidal zone is, in essence, two worlds occupying the same space on alternating schedules. When high tide sweeps in, it brings with it a burst of activity. Water fills crevices, surrounds boulders, and floods channels that just hours earlier were exposed to sun and wind. Schools of small fish glide over the landscape, seizing the chance to feed on algae-coated rocks and unsuspecting invertebrates. Mollusks extend their siphons to filter feed, confident that predators from the open ocean can reach them only during these brief submerged intervals. Crabs emerge from their burrows, scuttling with urgent purpose across the submerged terrain, claws ready to seize whatever food the tide has delivered. But as the tide retreats, the same area transforms almost instantly. The fish withdraw with the receding water, vanishing into deeper channels before they become stranded. Mollusks clamp their shells shut with practiced efficiency, sealing in moisture and sealing out danger. Crabs hurry toward burrows or shaded crevices, disappearing into safety before the sun exposes them to desiccation or sharp-eyed birds. In the absence of water, predators from the land, reptiles, amphibians, and eventually birds, exploit the vulnerable creatures left in isolated pools. The intertidal zone becomes a landscape of shrinking arenas, tide pools that trap small animals, rock ledges that host desperate standoffs, and sandflats where hiding becomes the dominant form of heroism. What makes this environment legendary in evolutionary terms is not the presence of predators alone, but the timing of their appearances. Predators arrive with the tide and leave with it, their opportunities dictated by gravitational rhythms rather than personal ambition. The result is a fluid battlefield where 2 hours of safety can be followed by 2 minutes of chaos. In such a place, natural selection becomes keenly attuned to timing. Animals that learn or evolve to retreat moments before danger arrives gain a profound advantage. Crabs become some of the earliest masters of this temporal art. Their ancestors, already equipped with armor and powerful limbs, now refine their behaviors to suit a world ruled by schedules. They forage aggressively when the tide is rising, snatching morsels delivered by the incoming water, then vanish into burrows the moment they sense the shift toward ebb tide. Many species develop an uncanny sensitivity to subtle cues, changes in water pressure, faint vibrations from distant waves, or even the filtering quality of light under rising water. Over generations, this precision becomes nearly ritualistic. A crab that misjudges the timing may find itself stranded among predators or drying in the heat. Outcomes evolution gradually weeds out. Mollusks, too, evolve in response to the intertidal pressures. Snails develop thicker shells and stronger foot muscles to cling securely to rock surfaces battered by waves. Some species learn to tuck themselves into crevices that remain moist even at low tide, while others rely on behavior, grazing intensively during high tide, then anchoring themselves motionless for hours when the water disappears. Mussels and barnacles adopt a different tactic entirely, forming dense clusters that provide mutual protection. Their strength lies not in combat, but in sheer, stubborn immobility. When the tide leaves, they simply refuse to move. Air exposure passes over them like weather over a stone wall, noticed but not invited inside. Meanwhile, early fish face their own set of opportunities and risks. Some species begin venturing onto mudflats during extremely high tides, snatching food unavailable in deeper waters. Others exploit temporary pools formed as the tide retreats, feeding on trapped crustaceans before slipping back into deeper channels. A few begin developing features that will one day be famous: primitive fins capable of supporting brief excursions across moist terrain. In these early attempts, timing once again determines success. A fish that lingers too long during a feeding frenzy may find itself stranded with no escape route, learning too late that the moon waits for no one. Tide pools, those miniature worlds carved into rock and reef, become microcosms of this evolutionary tension. Each pool hosts its own tiny succession of events as the hours pass. High-tide arrivals of fish and crabs, mid-tide battles among snails and small predators, and low-tide standoffs between creatures trapped together in shrinking water. Some animals thrive in these pools through ingenuity. Small crabs learn to flatten themselves under rocks. Amphipods wiggle into damp cracks. Even anemones adapt by folding inward when the water grows shallow, conserving moisture until relief returns. For many creatures, tide pools are both refuge and trap, a duality that drives extraordinary diversity. The intertidal zone also sharpens sensory evolution. Animals must detect not only their predators and prey, but the turning of the tide itself. Chemical cues in the water, vibrations through sediment, the tilt of sunlight, and even the faint scent of exposed algae all become signals. The ability to interpret these signals, to know when to feed, when to hide, and when to sprint toward the safety of depth, becomes a defining trait. Some animals survive simply by declining to be present when danger arrives. In the intertidal zone, absence can be the most efficient form of defense. As these coastal communities grow more intricate, the shoreline becomes a place of perpetual motion, not constant, but cyclically predictable. Every high tide invites a rush of activity. Every low tide imposes stillness. The creatures that flourish are those that treat timing as a form of muscle, flexed and refined through generations. Strength alone is not enough. Agility alone is insufficient. Success requires a kind of evolutionary punctuality. By the end of this chapter in Earth's story, the intertidal zone is no longer a fringe habitat. It is a vibrant battleground of rhythm and resilience, shaped by countless strategies designed to meet the sea on its own schedule. And though the animals here do not consciously track the moon's cycles, their bodies and behaviors align with them perfectly, living proofs that in a world ruled by tides, survival belongs to those who know precisely when not to be available. As life grows bolder along coastlines, a new kind of structure begins taking shape beneath the warm, shallow seas. a structure not built by accident or layering sediment, but by living architects far more intricate than the microbes that once dominated these waters. Coral reefs emerge, slowly and meticulously, as colonies of tiny polyps fuse their calcium carbonate skeletons into vast underwater fortresses. What begins as a few scattered clusters evolves, over millions of years, into sprawling, city-sized formations that rise from the seafloor like submerged mountain ranges. And with their rise, the relationship between waves, tides, and coastlines enters a new era, one where life doesn't merely respond to environmental forces, but reshapes them on a grand scale. Reefs choose their neighborhoods carefully. They form in warm, clear, sunlit waters where conditions are stable enough for calcium carbonate to accumulate without dissolving. These early reefs often develop along continental shelves or volcanic islands, places where tides deliver nutrients but do not overwhelm the builders with excessive sediment or cold upwellings. Each coral polyp, no larger than a grain of rice, plays its role quietly. It extends delicate tentacles into the water, feeds on drifting plankton, and secretes a thin skeletal layer beneath itself. Alone, a single polyp would leave only a whisper of influence. Together, multiplying into colonies of thousands, millions, and eventually entire ecosystems, they create structures resilient enough to stand against the endless motion of the sea. These reefs do not simply sit in the water, they converse with it. As waves approach from the open ocean, they encounter the rising lip of the reef's outer edge. The energy of the waves is broken, refracted, and softened. What might have been a crashing force dissipates into a gentler ripple by the time it reaches the shoreline. Tidal flows, too, change their patterns in the presence of these new barriers. Water slows as it approaches the reef, pools in areas protected by coral ridges, and accelerates through narrow channels that cut into the structures. The coastline behind the reef begins to experience a kind of hydraulic kindness, a tempering of the ocean's volatility. This is when lagoons begin to form. Protected by the reef's outer wall, shallow basins develop on the landward side, creating calm, sunlit havens where sediments accumulate more slowly and conditions remain consistently tranquil. These lagoons become nurseries for life. Fish lay eggs in the warm, protected shallows. Algae flourish, coating rocks and coral fragments in green and gold. Sponges, sea cucumbers, worms, and countless other creatures settle into these safe spaces, taking advantage of the dependable quietude offered by the reef's architecture. For the first time, large stretches of coastline find themselves sheltered behind living breakwaters. Farther seaward, the reef crest endures a more dramatic existence. It is battered during high tides, pounded by waves during storms, and exposed to air during the lowest tides. But the corals endure with remarkable tenacity. Their colonies interlock into sturdy frameworks. Their skeletons reinforce one another. When a wave slams into the reef, the energy disperses across millions of tiny walls, chambers, and channels. The reef does not resist by brute force. It resists by complexity. And every bit of energy it absorbs or redirects sends ripples of effect across the surrounding coastlines. The presence of reefs also alters how the tides behave in these regions. When the flood tide enters the lagoon, it must pass across as the reef crest or through specific channels. These choke points concentrate the flow, creating rapid currents that sweep nutrients and larvae inland. At ebb tide, the water retreats with equal determination, flushing the lagoon and exporting organic richness into open waters. This rhythmic exchange makes the reef lagoon system one of the most productive and dynamic environments on Earth. Not all corals are architects of sprawling structures. Some species prefer modest colonies, forming patches that fill gaps between larger reef ridges. Others encrust rocks, subtly reinforcing weak points in the reef's structure. Over time, as storms break off pieces, other organisms, algae, sponges, and new coral recruits, cement them into place. The reef becomes not just a single organism's creation, but a communal endeavor. Life builds upon life, repairing, expanding, and reshaping the coastline continuously. The ripple effects of these underwater cities extend far beyond coral communities. Fish evolve streamlined bodies to navigate the twisting channels. Some species develop brilliant colors to blend into the reef's textured backdrop. Crustaceans adopt specialized claws to anchor themselves within crevices blasted by surge. Even the tides adapt their influence, not by changing their celestial cause, but through new patterns of friction and flow created by the reef's sheer presence. What was once a simple shoreline gradient now becomes a labyrinth of microcurrents, eddies, and protected basins. As reefs grow, coastlines begin to stabilize in new ways. Sediments that once drifted freely become trapped behind coral barriers. Sandbanks form predictably. Shorelines stop eroding as quickly, giving plants, and eventually entire coastal ecosystems, opportunities to establish themselves in peace. Reefs, without ever intending to, become guardians of the land, shaping the contours of beaches, islands, and lagoons. They create not just habitats, but geography. Yet reefs are more than geological engineers. They are storytellers of time. Their layers record centuries of tidal cycles, storms, seasonal changes, and shifts in sea level. A slice through a mature coral colony reveals a history written with precision. Thick bands from rapid growing years, thin bands from leaner times, subtle chemical signatures from ancient currents that swept through the area long before human eyes would ever read them. In this era, reefs become one of life's most powerful tools for modification. While stromatolites built quietly upward in earlier chapters, reefs expand outward, upward, and sideways in living color, sculpting coastlines at scales that rival geological processes. They do not conquer the tides, but collaborate with them, converting raw wave energy into calm sanctuaries where life flourishes in layers. And so, in the rhythm of tides meeting reefs, Earth witnesses one of evolution's grandest collaborations. The sea brings motion, the corals bring form, and between them they craft coastlines that sustain diversity beyond anything the earlier oceans could have imagined. In the conversation between waves and reefs, entire ecosystems learn to speak, and the coastline listens, reshaped by every word. The steady, rhythmic pulse of the tides continues its ancient cadence, guided faithfully by the moon. But Earth itself cannot always maintain such consistency. Over long stretches of geological time, the planet slips in and out of vast ice ages, chapters marked by the slow advance and retreat of glaciers that reshape coastlines, rearrange oceans, and stretch the influence of tides across distances so great that life must either migrate or yield. In these eras, the intertidal zone becomes a nomadic world, vanishing from familiar places and reappearing elsewhere, as if the shoreline itself has developed wanderlust. Ice ages do not arrive suddenly. They creep forward generation after generation. Snow that fails to melt in high latitudes accumulates into ice sheets kilometers thick. Mountain glaciers expand down valleys. The weight of this ice presses continents downward, deforming the crust beneath them. But perhaps the most consequential change for coastal ecosystems is the way glaciers store water. Every cubic meter of ice is a cubic meter of ocean held hostage on land. As ice spreads across the continents, global sea levels fall, sometimes by more than 100 meters. For creatures accustomed to daily tidal cycles, such a change is nothing short of continental reorganization. Where water once lapped against ancient cliffs, dry ground now stretches outward for kilometers. Continental shelves, those gently sloping plains beneath shallow seas, rise into the open air, becoming new land masses exposed to the sun for the first time in millions of years. River deltas migrate, carving fresh paths across these newly unveiled surfaces. Former bays become grasslands. Coral reefs, built lovingly over countless generations, stand marooned above water, their vibrant builders gone, leaving behind ghostly white skeletons that crumble slowly in the dry air. And with every newly exposed kilometer of seafloor, the intertidal zone marches seaward, dragging entire ecosystems along with it. Creatures that once lived comfortably near the water's edge must now follow the shrinking shoreline if they wish to remain within the tidal world. Many succeed. Burrowing species creep gradually across the damp sands. Mollusks spread slowly into fresh sediments, and plants extend their roots into new soils closer to the receding sea. But others cannot adapt to the shifting terrain. Their habitats evaporate as the water pulls away. A slow attrition begins. Species vanish not because the tides ended, but because the tides moved without them. Yet even in this stark rearrangement, opportunities arise. Newly formed coastlines offer fresh surfaces for colonization. Sediments untouched by life become fertile territory for those that can arrive early. Certain hardy algae cling to exposed rocks, ready to reclaim them when the ocean returns, whether in centuries or millennia. Many crustaceans and mollusks, armed with mobility and resilience, thrive in these nascent intertidal zones, taking advantage of the sparse competition. The very mobility demanded by tidal life now becomes a tool for survival during continental-scale upheavals. Meanwhile, the ice sheets above continue their quiet, relentless creep. Their massive weight depresses the crust, while regions at the fringe rise slightly in compensation. The physical shape of Earth's surface distorts. Ocean basins deepen subtly, further altering sea levels, Tidal patterns shift as coastlines change shape and currents reroute around the new geography. The tides themselves remain faithful in timing, but their expression, where they reach, how far they travel, and the landscapes they sculpt, transforms dramatically. Then, eventually, the great reversal begins. As Earth warms, whether through orbital changes, atmospheric shifts, or the delicate dance of solar cycles, the glaciers melt. Ice withdraws like a slow tide in reverse, releasing vast amounts of water back into the oceans. Sea levels rise rapidly on geological scales, sometimes flooding hundreds of meters of terrain over a few millennia. River valleys become estuaries. Distant continental shelves once again submerge beneath shallow seas. Coastlines retreat landward, erasing the newly formed habitats that life had painstakingly colonized. For intertidal species, this change is equally challenging. The drowning of low-lying coastlines forces them to move inland, following the rising waters. But now the terrain they must occupy is not a blank canvas. It is often forested, vegetated, or occupied by species adapted to stable terrestrial environments. Salt marshes reclaim old floodplains. New mudflats form in drowned river mouths. The creatures that succeed are those capable of colonizing these transitional habitats quickly, often outpacing even the forests that yield grudgingly to the invading sea. Some species adapt spectacularly. Certain plants evolve the ability to tolerate waterlogged soils and brackish surges. Crabs exploit newly forming estuaries where rivers mix with tidal waters. Fish venture inland along expanding coastlines, discovering new feeding grounds in drowned valleys. Life surges into the new intertidal spaces with an enthusiasm that mirrors the pace of rising seas. But many species do not survive the rapid incursions. Coral reefs, already stressed by exposure during falling sea levels, now drown beneath too much water. Reefs require light. Deep water denies them their architectural agency. Entire reef systems, once bustling with life, become submerged boneyards, replaced only after millennia when new corals begin growing on the ruins. In these cycles of ice advance and retreat, the intertidal zone experiences expansions and contractions more dramatic than any daily tide. It migrates across continental margins, obliterates long-standing habitats, and births new ones. Species evolve migratory flexibility or perish. The shoreline becomes a moving target, demanding constant adaptation. What remains consistent through all of this is the indomitable resilience of life. Each ice age redraws the boundary between land and sea, and with every redraw, new ecosystems rise from the shifting line. The tides still come and go, but the places they touch are never the same for long. Species learn to wander with the water, living not just by the cycles of a day, but by the cycles of epochs. If evolution had a quiet observation during this era, it might note that while tides keep a steady beat, the stage they perform on is anything but stable. And those who dance along the shifting edges must learn to move not only with the rhythm of hours, but with the rhythm of ages. As the great ice sheets retreat and shorelines stabilize once more, Earth's coasts enter a gentler chapter. one shaped not by grinding glaciers or wandering seas, but by plants that finally commit to living in the water's daily rhythm rather than skirting cautiously around it. In this era, new botanical pioneers evolve strategies not merely to tolerate the twice-daily tides, but to embrace them. Mangrove forests and salt marshes rise along coastlines, transforming once harsh intertidal zones into expansive, breathing ecosystems. In their quiet, flexible way, they soften the edges of the land, proving to evolution that sometimes bending politely works better than standing stiffly. Before these ecosystems take root, the coastline is a mosaic of mudflats, shifting sediments, and low-lying areas regularly inundated by the tide. Salinity fluctuates wildly from day to day. The soil lacks structure, slumping and sliding with every wave. Few plants dare to stay. Those that do must withstand waterlogging, salinity, and an ever-moving foundation, conditions that would send most terrestrial vegetation retreating inland with great haste. But evolution, slow and persistent, eventually crafts species that regard these challenges not as warnings, but as invitations. Salt marshes form first in temperate regions, led by hardy grasses and sedges that learn to live with brackish water flowing around their stems. Their roots spread in dense networks, weaving through mud like silent stitching, binding sediments together. These plants develop remarkable adaptations, internal channels that carry oxygen from their leaves down into their flooded roots, salt glands that excrete excess salinity, and sturdy, flexible stems that sway with tidal currents rather than snapping under their pressure. What was once a bare expanse of mud becomes a green, humming expanse of blades and stems that rise and fall gently as the tides sweep in. These early marsh grasses do more than simply endure tidal flooding. They alter the environment around them. By slowing incoming water, they encourage sediments to settle. Over time, this buildup elevates the marsh platform, creating a landscape that sits delicately at the threshold between land and sea. Each tide brings a new thin layer of mud, trapped by the dense vegetation. Each receding tide leaves behind nutrients concentrated in the soils. The marsh becomes a natural amplifier of fertility, supporting snails, worms, crustaceans, and fish that migrate into the flooded grasses. Creatures learn to time their visits with the tides, slipping into the marsh at high water, to feed and retreating as the water drains, leaving behind a labyrinth of stems swaying in the breeze. While salt marshes thrive in cooler regions, a different botanical marvel emerges in warmer latitudes: the mangrove. If salt marsh grasses are the subtle stabilizers of the temperate world, mangroves are its tropical engineers, trees that have reinvented what it means to be a forest. Their roots twist above the waterline in tangled lattices, creating a structure that is part scaffold, part trap, and entirely transformational. Mangroves do not merely tolerate tidal flooding, they invite it. The adaptations of mangroves verge on botanical audacity. Their roots grow upward in snorkel-like projections called pneumatophores, allowing them to breathe even when the soil is submerged and oxygen poor. Some species excrete salt through their leaves, leaving behind tiny crystals that glitter faintly in the sun. Others filter salt at their roots, maintaining an internal freshwater balance like seasoned alchemists. Their trunks and branches lean in patterns shaped by prevailing tides and winds, forming curved silhouettes that seem to embody the ethos of their existence. Strength through flexibility. As mangrove forests expand, they become coastal fortresses, not against the sea, but in cooperation with it. Their stilt roots slow waves, breaking their force without resisting them directly. Sediments become trapped in the maze of roots, gradually building new land where once there was only open water. Over decades and centuries, mangrove forests extend seaward, not by marching across dry land, but by capturing the sea's own sediments and stitching them into new ground. Crabs burrow into the mud beneath the roots. Juvenile fish dart among the submerged tangles, safe from predators. Mollusks attach to root surfaces, filtering water as tides rise and fall around them. These ecosystems soften the violence of waves in ways no bare coast could achieve. During storms, their root networks diffuse wave energy, preventing erosion and protecting inland areas. During calm days, they moderate water flow, creating serene channels and sheltered basins that host a dazzling diversity of life. Mangroves and marshes become living buffers, ecosystems whose very existence transforms how the tides shape the land. The emergence of these plant communities dramatically alters the ecological choreography of coastal zones. The intertidal region, once a battleground dictated by timing, now becomes a nursery where life finds continuity even amid daily changes. Nutrients accumulate, productivity soars, and food webs expand in complexity. Birds arrive to nest in the high branches, fish linger in the roots, and countless invertebrates carve out niches in the soft, oxygen-rich mud. The richness of these habitats stems from the plant's remarkable ability to not just survive the tides, but harness their energy. In time, these ecosystems become some of Earth's most efficient carbon sinks, trapping organic material in slow-building layers of peat or mud. Their stems and roots breathe, grow, decay, and renew in endless cycles shaped by tidal rhythms. Everything within them thrives because of the tides, not despite them. If evolution could narrate this episode with a chuckle, it might say that the plants finally understood the wisdom of subtle flexibility. Instead of resisting the water's advances, they learned to greet each tide with a gentle bow, leaves angled, roots braced, stems swaying, and in doing so, transformed the coastline into a place where resilience is rooted not in defiance, but in graceful accommodation. And so the shores soften, waves quiet, sediments settle. Life multiplies in the sanctuary offered by mangroves and marshes. The coast, once a place of sharp transitions, becomes a world of blurred boundaries, a living conversation between land and sea, spoken in roots and tides. By the time Earth's story reaches the recent geological past, long after reefs sculpted wave patterns, after mangroves softened shorelines, after ice ages stretched and squeezed the boundaries of the sea, the coasts are alive with extraordinary diversity. The intertidal zone, once the domain of microbial mats and experimental early crawlers, has become one of the most finely tuned ecosystems on the planet. Every creature here, from the tiniest barnacle to the swiftest coastal bird, lives by an ancient schedule written not in sunlight or seasons, but in the moon's pull. The tides remain the planet's oldest clock, and life has grown exquisitely punctual in its response. Barnacles, perhaps the most patient among coastal inhabitants, illustrate this rhythm with remarkable precision. Permanently cemented to rocks, pilings, and whatever else finds itself in reach, they rely entirely on timing rather than mobility. When the tide rises, they open their tiny trapdoors and extend feathery appendages to sweep plankton from the water. When the tide falls, they clamp shut with a level of decisiveness that would impress even the most devoted hermit. Their shells lock so tightly that they can withstand scorching sun, pounding waves, and curious predators. A barnacle's day is a cycle of opportunity and hibernation, dictated by the rise and fall of the sea. After millions of years of evolution, they remain masters of commitment. Once they choose a spot, nothing short of geological upheaval will convince them to leave. Mussels and oysters share similar strategies, forming living mosaics that cling to rocks, forming beds as tough as armor. These creatures thrive in places where few others can, enduring exposure, collisions, and fluctuating salinity with enviable stoicism. Their dense colonies create miniature fortresses that shelter smaller organisms from waves and predators. In doing so, they shape ecosystems as much as reefs once did, but on a different scale. Micro-reefs offered in blue-black clusters and chalky layers. Modern fish also follow the tides with refined precision. Some species migrate into estuaries or coastal marshes only during high tide, venturing inland to feed on insects, crustaceans, or plant matter, before returning to deeper waters as the tide recedes. Their internal clocks are so finely calibrated that they begin moving minutes before the water shifts, responding to subtle cues such as changes in pressure or temperature. These migrations are not random, but choreographed, synchronized performances that repeat day after day, generation after generation, all without conscious planning. Evolution has simply carved tidal timing into their biology. Small fish dart among tide pools left behind on rocky shores, each pool a world of its own. Some tide pools host anemones and starfish locked in slow-motion duels. Others shelter gobies or blennies that wriggle between rocks, waiting for the next flood. These pools are miniature laboratories of adaptation, with species surviving in water that grows warmer, saltier, and increasingly oxygen-poor as the hours pass. When the tide returns, the pools burst with renewed motion, fresh oxygen, fresh food, fresh challenges. Crabs, those perpetual opportunists, scuttle across nearly every coastline on Earth. Their behavior has evolved into a near-perfect expression of tidal pragmatism. Many species time their feeding and mating activities with precision, emerging under the cover of rising tides to forage, retreating when the water withdraws. Some coordinate entire reproductive cycles with lunar phases, releasing larvae into the surf on nights when tides will carry them farthest from predatory shores. The timing is so consistent that in some regions, human observers use crab behavior as a kind of informal tide chart. It is a subtle reminder that in some ways, coastal life understands the moon's pull far better than we do. Birds, too, have tuned their lives to tidal rhythms. Wading species such as sandpipers, herons, and plovers patrol the exposed flats at low tide, probing the mud for worms, clams, and crustaceans that had no intention of being discovered, but find themselves revealed by the retreating water. These birds seem to move with purpose and urgency, as if aware that the window for feeding is brief. When the tide rises, they retreat to higher ground, preen feathers, or rest until the sea grants them another opportunity. Migratory shorebirds plan their long-distance journeys around these feeding cycles, timing their arrival at coastal stopover points to coincide with tides that maximize foraging success. A bird with perfect timing can gather enough energy to fly thousands of kilometers. One that miscalculates may find itself stranded in the wrong place with the wrong tide. Seaweeds and coastal algae also follow the tides more subtly. Their tissues must endure periods of drying without losing the ability to photosynthesize once submerged again. Some species grow thick, rubbery blades that resist tearing in surf. Others grow in delicate filaments that take advantage of calm tide pools. Their presence creates shelter for countless small animals, their holdfasts anchoring ecosystems in place as effectively as any set of roots. Predators play their part in this rhythmic struggle. Raccoons, foxes, and coastal mammals learn to patrol shorelines during low tide, taking advantage of stranded fish or exposed shellfish beds. In tropical regions, monitor lizards and even crocodiles adapt to similar opportunities. The intertidal zone offers a dependable feast for those who understand its schedule, and a dangerous trap for creatures caught outside their safe hours. Human cultures eventually join this complex dance, reading tides to navigate harbors, harvest shellfish, farm coastal plants, and predict seasonal migrations of fish. Long before scientific measurements existed, communities built their lives around the moon's pull, interpreting tidal movements with deep generational knowledge. The coast became a meeting place of science, culture, and nature's oldest metronome. Despite all this change, the great constant remains: the moon, unhurried and unwavering, pulling the oceans with the same steady rhythm it established billions of years ago. Life along modern coasts negotiates its terms with this force, adjusting behaviors, anatomies, and entire life cycles to a schedule as old as Earth's earliest days. Every barnacle that seals itself shut, every fish that turns with the incoming tide, every bird that takes flight before the waters rise, participates in a grand choreography shaped by gravitational conversation. In the modern era, the intertidal zone is a place of both ancient rhythms and familiar struggles. It is a world where survival depends not on resisting the tides, but on living gracefully within their rhythm, an echo of lessons learned across all chapters of evolution's coastal story. As we draw back from the fine details of creatures and coastlines, letting the camera of deep time widen its gaze, Earth's shores reveal themselves not as fixed places, but as living boundaries, places defined by motion rather than permanence. The tides, guided by the moon with unbroken loyalty, have continued their rise and fall for billions of years, They have outlasted continents, species, and entire ecosystems. They have seen glaciers advance like white continents and retreat like melting memories. Through it all, the water keeps returning. It is the oldest repetition in nature, a gentle insistence that shapes the world through patience rather than force. Coastlines come and go. Some form as volcanic islands cool from fiery youth into gentle slopes kissed by waves. Others appear as rivers build deltas grain by grain, extending land into the sea. Some vanish as sea levels rise, slipping beneath the waves with quiet inevitability. Still others break apart under storms or tectonic shifts, only to be rebuilt by sediments drifting along shore in slow, silty migrations. But whatever the coastlines shape in any era, jagged cliffs, soft marshlands, coral-edged lagoons, or sandy crescents, the tides are always there, stitching water to land with a rhythmic thread. If we could watch Earth's history unfold like a time-lapse crafted for cosmic viewers, the shorelines would flicker and pulse. Reefs would bloom and crumble. Marshes would swell and recede. Ice sheets would stride across continents like giants, pushing the ocean back, only to melt and invite it forward again. Mountain ranges would rise from the sea floor, and volcanoes would cast new islands into existence. Yet through each transformation, the tides would continue their simple cycle, an unfaltering signal amid Earth's shifting landscapes. Life in all its diversity has never conquered this rhythm. Instead, it has evolved to fit inside it. The first tide-touched microbes clung to sediments in patience, waiting for flood and drought to shape their chemistry. Ancient animals tested movement along the shore, learning timing before they learned grace. Plants approached the coast with caution, adapting roots and leaves to the water's unpredictable moods. Reefs built strongholds, marshes softened shores, and creatures learned to scuttle, burrow, cling, and leap in time with the returning water. Each adaptation was not a triumph over the tides, but a quiet agreement with them. The shoreline, more than any other habitat, teaches life that the world is always in motion. Creatures that survive here do so by embracing uncertainty. Some endure dryness with sealed shells. Others ride incoming waters with the effortless trust of experience. Some hide when the tide retreats. Others wait patiently in calm pools left behind. Every strategy, simple or complex, stems from the same recognition. The sea will return, but not on anyone's schedule except its own. Even now, in the modern age, the tides remain unchanged. They respond to celestial mechanics older than any lineage on Earth. The moon, Earth's steadfast companion, has been slowly drifting away over billions of years, just a few centimeters annually. But its influence remains one of the most reliable forces on the planet. The tides follow its lead with quiet obedience, reminding every shoreline organism, from barnacle to heron, that some parts of nature operate on scales far beyond the reach of individual lives. From a higher perspective, the tidal rhythm becomes a metaphor written into the planet's biology. Every rise and fall mirrors cycles that occur far from the coastline: the growth and decay of forests, the waxing and waning of ice, the appearance and extinction of species. Even human civilizations, for all their ingenuity, build their coastal cities with an eye on the tides, measuring harbors, fishing grounds, and shipping routes by the same timetable that guided ancient sea life. The existence of tides has shaped languages, calendars, economies, and myths. Long before humans understood gravity or orbital dynamics, they understood the moon's quiet influence on the shore. There is comfort in this constancy. No matter how dramatic the changes on land, tectonic upheavals, evolutionary bursts, climate swings, the tides trace their ancient paths with serene persistence. They offer a gentle reminder that change and regularity are not opposing forces, but partners. The tides change constantly, yet in their change they are perfectly consistent. As we linger on this final view of Earth's coasts, it is tempting to imagine evolution offering a final whisper of humor. Perhaps something like, "The ocean never stops knocking. Life just learned when to answer." And this, more than anything, captures the essence of Earth's tidal story. Life has never sought to dominate the tides or escape their pull. Instead, it has learned to move with them, timing its breaths, migrations, and growth to the returning water. The shoreline remains a place where patience is strength, where anticipation is survival, and where resilience is practiced in every generation. It is here, at this meeting point of water and land, that life has repeatedly adapted, reinvented itself, and found new possibilities. And as long as the moon remains in the sky, as long as Earth continues its ancient dance, the water will keep returning, soft, insistent, and eternal.